The arrival of US air power to the European theatre in 1942 was, at first, dismissed by the Third Reich's senior leadership. The Luftwaffe's commanders disparaged the United States Army Air Force, its combat capabilities, and the scale of US military production. But this arrogance flew in the face of the available evidence. Political leaders in Berlin had, until that point, been receiving detailed and accurate intelligence reports about the development of four-engine bombers in the US, and the country's stunning ability to produce military equipment at scale. Germany's highest-ranking commanders ignored this information at the time. Moreover, by mid-1942, the Luftwaffe was ill-prepared to face a significant increase in air combat over Western Europe, with most of its resources being swallowed up on the Eastern Front. At the time, the Luftwaffe had about 300 operational single-engine fighters stationed from Holland to the northwest coast of France as a first line of defense against Allied aircraft. Many of these fighters were Fw-190s and the latest Bf-109 variants because, although the bulk of the Luftwaffe fighter force was facing off against the Soviets, Germany's latest aircraft designs were all stationed in the West. The Fw-190, for instance, didn't reach the Eastern Front until well into 1942, despite entering service in August of 1941. However, as US heavy bombers entered the skies over Europe for the first time, German pilots were shocked by their tightly packed formations, exceptional defensive armament, and survivability. The B-17 Flying Fortress in particular could absorb extreme damage, earning itself a reputation on both sides of the Channel. To cope with the size and armor of the American bomber fleet, later variants of the Bf-109G, including sub-variants of the G6, replaced existing MG-17 machine guns with heavier MG-131s, boasting 13mm rounds, an engine-mounted 30mm cannon, and sometimes two underwing 20mm cannons. This heavy armament was effective against bomber formations but reduced the aircraft's maneuverability and combat performance against Allied fighters. Throughout 1943, German fighter defenses in the West increased significantly as the Luftwaffe shifted resources away from the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts to deal with the growing threat of Allied bombers. By the middle of the year, the number of single-engine fighters in the Western theatre increased from just over 300 to 600. This shift meant that by the second quarter of 1943, almost a third of Germany's fighters were positioned to face the British and American combined bomber offensive. The effect of the German fighter build-up on American bombing raids was clear. During 1942, about 13% of US bombers were hit by enemy aircraft, but this number increased to over 18% by June 1943. American daylight bombing raids paid a heavy price when they went beyond fighter escort range, which for most of that year only extended about 300 miles over the European continent. This was insufficient to support air raids on targets inside Germany itself. Meanwhile, the Third Reich's most advanced and heavily armed aircraft were tested against US fighters, which were now beginning to arrive in greater numbers in England. In the first half of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were locked in air-to-air combat with the P-47 Thunderbolt, which was beginning to equip US fighter groups in Europe. At this time, early variants of the P-47C and D could meet Luftwaffe fighters on even terms only at high altitudes, but were vulnerable at lower altitudes where they were easily outmaneuvered. Even so, the American fighter was already stamping its mark on the skies over Europe. In July 1943, during Blitz Week, the largest dogfight between German and American fighters until that point took place. 107 P-47s went head-to-head with between 150 and 200 German fighters, comprising a mix of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, attacking a formation of US bombers. The result was clear. The P-47s claimed 24 confirmed German fighter kills, 1 probable, and 8 damaged for the loss of 7 Thunderbolts. However, it should be noted that the Luftwaffe faced the inverse of its experience during the Battle of Britain. Defending fighters now had to tackle massive waves of bombers and accompanying escort fighters. America's other major escort aircraft at the time, the P-38 Lightning, was much less effective against Luftwaffe opposition. As it arrived in greater numbers in the second half of 1943, the P-38 came with a patchy track record from operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The P-38's main strengths, including its exceptional range and speed, could not compensate for its flaws, such as inadequate engine performance and slower dive speed relative to single-engine Luftwaffe aircraft. Faced with a growing threat of American fighters, the Luftwaffe leadership positioned lighter Bf-109 fighter groups, which excelled at higher altitudes, on the perimeter of the Reich's airspace to attack and contain the US escort aircraft. Heavy fighters, including Bf-110 variants and Fw-190s, were stationed to the rear to engage American bombers beyond their escort's range. As a result, the second half of 1943 was generally considered a high point for the Luftwaffe in terms of the losses imposed on US air assets. A case in point is the destruction of 60 bombers, including the loss of 600 aircrew, during a raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943, out of a total of 291 aircraft. This was equivalent to a 20% loss rate and a nearly 50% damage rate. Only 35 German fighters were downed in response. But the Luftwaffe paid a heavy price for this period of success, losing 276 single-engine fighters in September and 284 in October. These losses were unsustainable when German aircrews faced existential pressure on other fronts. In time, it would also hit the quality of the Luftwaffe's personnel. The degradation of experienced aircrews led to German fighter groups relying on amateur pilots with drastically reduced basic training. Luftwaffe fighter pilots received 175 hours of flying training at the time, but only 30 hours were spent in fighter aircraft, and by early 1944, this had slipped to just 25 hours. In contrast, US pilot trainees received 340 hours of training, with 140 hours spent in combat aircraft. This fact alone led to a massive imbalance in pilot skill between German and Allied air forces. Adolf Galland described the capabilities of Allied pilots as astonishingly high. As a result, Luftwaffe pilot losses were staggering. In 1943, the Luftwaffe trained 3,276 new fighter pilots, but lost most of these new recruits, 2,870, in combat over the year. The situation went from bad to worse in early 1944 as US strategy changed to give escort fighters the freedom to seek and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, releasing them from a more defensive posture in relation to the bomber formations. It coincided with the greater presence and use of the P-51B Mustang in the long-range escort role, allowing the US to project fighter aircraft deep into German airspace. The Mustang combined the range of a four-engine bomber with the ability to handle any Luftwaffe fighter opposition thanks to its speed, acceleration, and maneuverability. It was also cheaper to produce than other American fighters. By mid-1944, the Mustang had evolved into the classic and most produced P-51D variant, cementing its place in aviation history. The P-51 gave the US the key strategic edge in the air war over Europe and devastated the Luftwaffe's fighter force. In early 1944, Mustangs made up about 10% of the US escort force, but were responsible for 30% of all aerial victories. The 4th Fighter Group, which switched from Thunderbolts to Mustangs in February 1944, saw its aerial victories spike dramatically as a result of the change. By the middle of March, its pilots had racked up nearly 350 kills in just a month and a half. The P-51 would ultimately account for about half of all enemy aircraft shot down in combat. The impact of US fighter escorts can be seen in the changing structure of air-to-air kills imposed on the Luftwaffe by its American opponents. In the summer of 1943, about 90% of German fighter losses stemmed from US bombers, a figure which fell closer to 70% by the autumn of that year. But in the first half of 1944, American fighter escorts accounted for about 90% of German fighter kills. For the Luftwaffe, these developments were catastrophic. Between January and June 1944, 2,262 pilots were lost, including many of the Luftwaffe's remaining aces, representing the last of Germany's most experienced pilots. By the time of the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, the Luftwaffe could only contribute 100 sorties to the defense effort. It was, in effect, a spent force. Over the year, the Luftwaffe to Allied fighter loss ratio was 8-1. However, the genius of Germany's aerial design and engineering capabilities lasted throughout the war. Rocket and jet technology was one area where the Luftwaffe led the US and the wider world. The introduction of the Me-262 in mid-1944 represented the pinnacle of German engineering and design capabilities. It was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D and boasted outstanding armament, including 4 30mm cannons. Still, by the war's end, only 1,433 aircraft had been produced, but only about 400 of these became operational, meaning there were too few units to make a difference. Me-262 pilots scored early air-to-air victories in August 1944 against a British Mosquito reconnaissance plane and a US B-24 Liberator. The first full-strength Me-262 fighter unit didn't appear until October. A massive American bomber raid on October 7 that included nearly 1,500 aircraft attacking industrial facilities across Germany came under heavy attack from about 80 Luftwaffe Bf-109s and Fw-190s, as well as 5 rocket-powered Me-163s and the complete Me-262 fighter unit. The encounter was a disaster for the Luftwaffe fighters. The Me-163s destroyed 1 B-17 bomber but lost 3 aircraft in total, 2 to accidents and 1 that was chased to low altitude by a pair of US P-51 escort fighters and shot down. The Me-262 unit faced similar troubles. 2 aircraft were lost for reasons unknown, while US fighters shot down 2 others. On April 10, 1945, the so-called Jet Massacre occurred on what has been described as the most active day for jet combat in the entire conflict. A total of 63 Me-262s faced off against a massive US air raid, which included over 1,300 B-17s and B-24s and over 900 P-51 and P-47 fighter escorts. The German jets shot down at least 10 B-17s before Mustang pilots took out at least 21 Me-262s in aerial combat, while other aircraft were lost to non-combat causes. Despite the Me-262's amazing potential, its value to the war effort was negligible. The Luftwaffe's defeat stemmed from failures in strategic decision-making and a dysfunctional organizational structure. However, German fighters remained a formidable threat until late into the war. Upgrades to the Bf-109 ensured that an aircraft designed in the early to mid-1930s remained competitive with newer Allied fighters for most of the conflict. The last production variant of the Bf-109 was the K series, introduced in mid-1944, although the earlier G variant was the most produced model of the entire conflict. Kurt Tank's legendary TA-152 was the last piston-engine Luftwaffe fighter designed to enter service in late 1944, and has been described as perhaps the ultimate piston-engine fighter of the Second World War. The TA-152 was capable of reaching speeds of about 750 km an hour at an altitude of just over 13,000 meters or 43,000 feet, and could, as pilots described, turn around its own tail. Only 39 units were ever produced, with just a handful of these reaching frontline fighter groups. So how did German fighters stack up against the best Allied designs? During and after the conflict, German assessments concluded the Bf-109K and later Fw-190 D9 and D12 variants were equal to any Allied opponent in air-to-air encounters, including the latest P-51, P-47, Spitfire, and Tempest variants. The Military Analysis Division of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey reached the same conclusion when analyzing the Luftwaffe and Allied fighters throughout the war, saying, "The difference in performance was not great enough to give either side a decided advantage." The exception was the P-51, which US analysts claimed to be superior to Luftwaffe fighters and a clear factor in achieving aerial dominance. While the relative performance of Luftwaffe and Allied fighter aircraft remains a point of debate, one clear difference between the two sides is the record-setting achievements of German pilots in air-to-air combat. Luftwaffe pilots during World War II achieved the highest numbers of air-to-air victories ever recorded, while the top 100 fighter pilots of all time are all German. Throughout the war, 5,081 Luftwaffe fighter pilots operating during daylight hours recorded at least one aerial victory. In terms of total numbers, these airmen downed 54,835 Allied aircraft. But the concentration of air-to-air victories among German pilots was astonishing, The leading 100 pilots scored almost as many aerial victories as the bottom 4,900, meaning German aces absolutely dominated in terms of overall kill counts. It also meant they blew past the numbers recorded by Allied pilots. There are a number of reasons for this. One of them is that Luftwaffe fighter pilots throughout the war and across all fronts were flying many more sorties per day than their Allied opponents. For instance, the greatest fighter ace of all time, Erich Hartmann, who shot down 352 Allied aircraft, first joined a fighter wing in October 1942 and flew 1,400 sorties throughout the war. This gave Hartmann a victory in 1 out of every 4 sorties. Interestingly, his counterpart, Günther Rall, the third highest scoring ace of all time with 275 victories, scored a victory in every second sortie he flew. Yet Rall was shot down 5 times and seriously injured on a number of occasions, limiting his flying time throughout the war. Experts think this points to a more aggressive air combat posture than that of Hartmann. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe did not rotate pilots out of active service, though leave was granted on an ad hoc basis, so German airmen operated under a general policy of fly till you die. Another factor is that the Luftwaffe was for years facing off against vast numbers of poorly trained Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front who, for a while, were flying inferior aircraft. This provided ample opportunity for German pilots to rack up huge numbers of aerial victories. Finally, the flying tactics of Luftwaffe fighter wings in no way resembled an even team. Ace pilots were prioritized and other aircraft were supposed to protect and support their efforts in air combat. This ensured a small number of outstanding airmen dominated most aerial victories. But when we consider the Luftwaffe's performance during World War II, it's important to note one thing. German air power and air doctrine were on the back foot immediately after the Battle of France. The losses sustained during that campaign, coupled with growing pilot exhaustion, were compounded by a bruising loss in the Battle of Britain, which probably turned out to be the most consequential air campaign of the war. From then on, stalling aircraft production rates and an insufficient pipeline of new pilots meant the Luftwaffe had already lost. Defeat was just a matter of time.